On April 20th, 1963, a 17-year-old girl walked down the aisle at St. Martin of Tours Catholic Church in Los Angeles and married the most famous young man in America. She was already pregnant. Her name was Sharon Kristin Harmon. She had grown up with every advantage mid-century California could offer: a Heisman Trophy winner for a father, a model and actress for a mother, a brother who would become one of the most recognizable faces on American television. She attended one of the most exclusive schools in Bel Air. She was beautiful, poised, and born into exactly the kind of family that mid-century America held up as proof that the system worked. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. From the inside, as Kristen Nelson would say herself, decades later, it was a fairy tale she spent her whole life fighting, first trying to be it, then trying to tell the truth about it. What followed was a 22-year marriage that produced 4 children and destroyed 2 people in different ways. An addiction, a custody battle against her own brother, a plane crash on New Year's Eve that killed her ex-husband. This is the story of Kristen Nelson and the 4 children caught in the middle of everything that became of her. Welcome to her story. Chapter 1. Born into Everything: The Harmon Family and the California Dream. To understand what Kristen Nelson lost, you have to understand what she started with. Because what she started with was considerable, and the distance between that starting point and where she ended up is the measure of everything this story is about. Sharon Kristin Harmon was born on June 25th, 1945, in Burbank, California. Her father was Tom Harmon, one of the most celebrated athletes in American sporting history. Tom Harmon had won the Heisman Trophy in 1940 as a halfback at the University of Michigan, where he was so dominant that he was known simply as Old 98, the number on his jersey. He rushed for an extraordinary 2,134 yards in his career at Michigan. In 1940, the same year he won the Heisman, he finished second in the voting for the Associated Press Male Athlete of the Year. He also served his country in a way that turned his celebrity into something more substantial than athletic fame. Tom Harmon was a military pilot in World War II. He was shot down twice, once over South America in April 1943, when he survived a crash in the Venezuelan jungle and walked out over 11 days. Then again over China in November 1943, when he was shot down by Japanese fire and survived again. He was, by any measure, an extraordinary human being, a Heisman Trophy winner, a twice shot down war survivor, a man who walked out of a jungle and out of occupied territory and kept going. After the war, he became one of the most recognizable sports broadcasters in California, working in both radio and television. Kristen's mother, Elise Knox, was an actress and model whose face had appeared in films throughout the 1940s. She was photogenic in the specific way that Hollywood prized in that era: poised, warm, the kind of woman who could carry a scene without demanding the center of it. Between Tom Harmon's athletic celebrity and Elise Knox's entertainment career, the Harmon household occupied exactly the kind of elevated mid-century California status that surrounded children with famous people and famous expectations simultaneously. Kristen had a sister, Kelly Harmon, who became an actress and model, most recognizably eventually as the spokesperson for a long-running series of Tic Tac commercials, which gave her a specific kind of cultural visibility that lasted well past the advertisements themselves. She had a brother, Mark Harmon, who became one of the most enduring leading men in American television, starring as Special Agent Leroy Jethro Gibbs in NCIS for 18 seasons, becoming one of the most consistently watched performers in the history of network television drama. Both siblings would end up deeply entangled in Kristen's adult life, not primarily as sources of support, but as the people on the other side of her most public failures. Kristen attended Marymount High School in Bel Air, an exclusive Catholic girls' school in the hills above Los Angeles, where the enrollment list reads, in retrospect, like a directory of Hollywood adjacency. Among her classmates was Mia Farrow, the daughter of director John Farrow and actress Maureen O'Sullivan, who would go on to her own extraordinary and complicated life. Kristin and Mia were close friends. Both of them, in different ways and through different mechanisms, would discover that the California establishment they had been born into was not quite the solid foundation it appeared from the outside. At 12 years old, Kristin Harmon was in the studio audience for a television production and encountered Ricky Nelson for the first time. She was, as she would later describe herself, just another 12-year-old fan. He was 17. 5 years later, on Christmas Day, 1961, when she was 16 and he was 21, they began dating. A year after that, they were engaged. And then she was pregnant, and then she was 17 and walking down the aisle, and then she spent the next 55 years of her life navigating the consequences of that particular beginning. Chapter 2. Ricky Nelson, the Fairy Tale, and What It Was Built On. To understand Kristin's marriage, you have to understand who Ricky Nelson actually was, not the image, which was very carefully maintained and very publicly consumed, but the reality underneath it. Eric Hilliard Nelson was born on May 8, 1940, in Teaneck, New Jersey. His father, Ozzie Nelson, was a big band leader who had married his vocalist, Harriet Hilliard. The family moved to Hollywood when Ricky was a toddler. In 1944, when Ricky was 4 years old, the family began a radio show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, that would transfer to television in 1952 and run for 14 seasons until 1966. It was one of the longest-running situation comedies in American television history, and it created something unprecedented, a family that was simultaneously a real family and a television family, playing fictionalized versions of themselves for nearly 2 decades while America watched. The Ozzie and Harriet version of the Nelson family was a version of the American dream so polished it practically reflected light. Ozzie was the wise, slightly bumbling patriarch. Harriet was the warm, capable mother. David was the responsible eldest son. And Ricky was the younger son, lovable, a little mischievous, growing up week by week in front of an audience that felt it knew him personally. The genius of the show was that the audience's investment in the fictional Nelsons transferred directly to the real ones. When Ricky went on a date on the show, the girls watching at home felt something real. When Ricky played a guitar on camera, the response was the same response they had to any genuine pop idol. Ricky Nelson began recording music in 1957 when he was 16 years old. The origin story has become famous. He wanted to impress a girl by casually mentioning that he was recording at the same label as Elvis Presley. He arranged a recording session. A song was played on an episode of the family show, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. His first single reached number 4 on the Billboard chart. His second went to number 1. By 17, he was one of the most commercially successful recording artists in America, selling records at a rate that put him in genuine competition with Elvis Presley, while simultaneously being the wholesome, clean-cut son of the most beloved family on American television. The tension in that dual identity was never resolved. Ozzie Nelson managed Ricky's music career with the same controlling instinct he brought to the television show, shaping it, packaging it, ensuring it served the family brand while also generating revenue. Ricky Nelson was simultaneously a genuine musical talent who would, in his later career, record some of the most respected roots rock and country rock of his era, and a product that had been partially manufactured before he was old enough to manufacture anything himself. He was, in other words, a complicated man to be married to. A man whose public identity had been constructed before he was an adult. a man who had never fully existed outside the framework of his family's brand. A man who was genuinely talented and who was also, at some fundamental level, still fighting for the right to be himself rather than the character his father had written. When he met Kristin Harmon again in 1961, this time not as a 12-year-old fan, but as a 16-year-old girl from a prominent California family, the attraction was real. They dated for a year, they became engaged, and then Kristin became pregnant. They were married on April 20th, 1963, at St. Martin of Tours Catholic Church in Los Angeles. Ricky was 22. Kristin was 17, not yet 18, married with her parents' consent, already carrying their first child. Ricky later described the marriage, with a candor that must have been somewhat painful to hear, as a shotgun wedding. He received instruction in Catholicism before the ceremony and signed a pledge to baptize their children in the Catholic faith. From the outside, it was the perfect California story. The teen idol and the football hero's daughter joined in a Catholic ceremony, joining their considerable family legacies in a union that the public was eager to celebrate. Kristin joined the cast of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet immediately after the wedding, appearing in the episode titled Rick's Wedding Ring, and becoming, almost overnight, another member of one of America's most beloved entertainment families. She would say later, with the clarity of someone who had spent decades understanding what it had actually been, I spent my whole life fighting the fairy tale. First trying to be it, then trying to tell the truth. The truth was that she had married into a brand, and the brand had rules. Chapter 3. The 4 children, what they were born into. 4 children. Let's establish who they were and when they arrived, because understanding the children means understanding what was at stake in everything that followed. The first child was Tracy Christine Nelson, born on October 25th, 1963, 6 months after the wedding. Slightly premature, weighing 4 pounds and 1 ounce at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, California. She was the child whose impending arrival had defined the timing of her parents' marriage. As a preschooler, she appeared in the 1968 film Yours, Mine, and Ours alongside Lucille Ball, her first screen credit before she could read, a function of being born into a family where appearing on camera was simply what one did. As a teenager, she attended the Westlake School for Girls, the kind of exclusive institution that the Nelson family's social position made available. She would go on to become a professional dancer and a successful actress, appearing in numerous television productions and films across a career that she built largely on her own considerable talent rather than simply on her parents' names. The second and third children arrived together. Gunnar Eric Nelson and Matthew Gray Nelson were born on September 20th, 1967, as twins. Twin boys arriving into a marriage that was already under strain, into a family dynamic that was already complicated by Ricky's touring schedule and the particular pressures of celebrity life in the late 1960s. Both boys would follow their father into music. Shortly after Ricky's death in 1985, when the twins were 18 years old, they formed the band Nelson, a rock duo that achieved its own significant commercial success in 1990 with the album After the Rain and the single Can't Live Without Your Love and Affection, which reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. They built their music careers in genuine tribute to their father rather than simply in exploitation of his name. The fourth child was Sam Hilliard Nelson, born on August 29th, 1974, the youngest by 7 years. Sam arrived into a household that was already struggling. The marriage had been in difficulty for years by the time he was born, and his earliest years were shaped by the turbulence of his parents' increasingly fractured relationship. He would later become a singer and songwriter, continuing the family's musical tradition. But his childhood would be defined, more than his siblings were, by the custody disputes and the family instability that characterized the final years of his parents' marriage and the years that followed his father's death. 4 children, born across 11 years of a marriage that was publicly celebrated and privately destructive, each of them inheriting in different proportions the talent and the damage that their parents' life together had produced. Chapter 4. The marriage beneath the surface, addiction, absence, and the slow collapse. The public story of the Nelson marriage was the television story, the family that had appeared together on one of America's most beloved programs, The Teen Idol and His Beautiful Wife, the picture-perfect California family with the Mulholland Drive estate and the 4 talented children. The private story was something else entirely. Ricky Nelson was a touring musician in the era when touring musicians operated without the structured support systems that would develop in later decades. He was away from home for long periods. He was surrounded by the specific environment of rock and roll life in the 1960s and 1970s, the drugs, the women, the particular freedoms that fame and distance from home provided. There were persistent reports of infidelities throughout the marriage. The couple was, by multiple accounts, on the verge of splitting by 1975. Kristin Nelson, meanwhile, was managing a household and 4 children in the specific isolation of a wife whose husband was consistently absent. She was also, during these years, developing the addiction that would consume the following decades of her life. The specific substances involved, primarily cocaine and alcohol, based on the documented accounts of the custody proceedings that followed, were not unusual in the entertainment world of that era. What was unusual was the severity and the duration of the problem, and the way it interacted with the losses that were accumulating around her. By 1975, the marriage was effectively over in every meaningful sense. The couple existed in the same household, but not in any recognizable partnership. When Ricky returned from a tour in 1977, he found that Kristin had moved his belongings out of their home and into a rented house. She had, effectively, ended the marriage unilaterally by making his physical presence in the family home no longer a given. In October 1977, Kristin filed for divorce for the first time. She asked for alimony, custody of their 4 children, and a portion of the community property. The couple temporarily reconciled, a pattern that is common in marriages with this specific combination of history, children, and financial complexity. The reconciliation did not hold. In April 1980, in what turned out to be one of the final gestures of the marriage's public face, Ricky and Kristin purchased an estate on Mulholland Drive that had originally been owned by Errol Flynn. The price was $750,000. It was an extraordinary purchase for a couple whose marriage was already broken and whose finances were already strained. But the Nelsons had spent their entire relationship inside a public narrative, and the public narrative required a certain kind of house. In October 1980, Kristin filed for divorce again. This time, she didn't withdraw the petition. The divorce proceedings were, by any measure, devastating. Kristin wanted Rick to give up music and focus on acting and domestic life. Rick had no intention of giving up touring. The dispute over his career, compounded by the financial questions and the custody arrangements, produced 2 years of acrimony that was extensively covered by the California press. In February 1981, Kristin was temporarily granted custody of the 4 children and $3,600 monthly in spousal support. Rick was required to pay family expenses, property taxes, medical bills, school tuition. Kristin claimed he was hiding assets. Rick's representatives countered that he was, in fact, nearly broke, that the extravagant lifestyle of the Nelson years had consumed most of what his recording career had produced, and that the attorneys and accountants were consuming what remained. The divorce was finalized on December 27, 1982. The financial cost was staggering. Attorneys and accountants took more than $1 million from the proceedings. Both parties emerged in worse financial shape than they had entered. Tracy, the eldest, lived with her father at the Mulholland Drive house during the worst of the marital conflict. The twins moved in with Ricky as soon as they turned 18, approximately 3 months before his death. Sam, the youngest, the most vulnerable, the most directly shaped by the chaos of those years, was passed between relatives in a way that tells you everything about how far the family's organizational structure had collapsed. During the divorce battle, he was cared for by his Aunt Kelly. Then he spent 18 months with his maternal grandparents, Tom and Elise Harmon. Then he went to live with Mark Harmon and Pam Dauber. Sam was 8 years old when his parents began their second and final divorce filing. He was 11 when it was finalized. He was the child most directly in the path of what was happening, and the adults around him were doing the best they could, which was not always enough. Chapter 5, December 31st, 1985, the plane crash and the end of whatever was left. Whatever the marriage had been, and whatever Kristin and Rick's relationship after the divorce had become, December 31st, 1985 ended it with the finality that only death can provide. Ricky Nelson, 45 years old, was traveling with his band from Guntersville, Alabama to Dallas, Texas for a New Year's Eve performance. He was flying in a converted DC-3 that had reportedly been having mechanical problems in the days before the flight. The aircraft caught fire in the air over DeKalb, Texas. It crashed near the town of DeKalb at approximately 5:45 in the afternoon on December 31st, 1985. Everyone aboard was killed. Ricky Nelson, his fiancée, Helen Blair, his entire touring band, 7 people in total, dead on the last afternoon of the year. The cause of the fire was investigated and ultimately attributed to the aircraft's heating system. A faulty heater had ignited fuel that had leaked into the cabin. There was early speculation about drug use, fueled in part by the presence of drug paraphernalia found at the crash site, but the National Transportation Safety Board's final report identified the heating system malfunction as the cause. Rick Nelson was 45 years old. He was, at the time of his death, engaged to Helen Blair and working to rebuild a career that had been financially constrained by the divorce. Kristin Nelson was 40 years old when she received the news. She had been divorced from Rick for 3 years. Whatever the marriage had been, and whatever they had done to each other, he was the father of her 4 children, the man she had met when she was 12 years old, the person whose life had been woven into hers since she was a teenager. His death removed any possibility of resolution, of the kind of eventual peace that divorced couples sometimes find when their children grow up and the acute conflict of the custody years recedes. The funeral was, by multiple accounts, a tense and painful event. Kristin attended knowing that her relationship with the Nelson family was already complicated. She was also, at this point, already thinking about what Ricky's death meant financially, about the life insurance, about the estate, about the 4 children who needed to be provided for. She approached Ricky's brother, David Nelson, who was administering the estate, about a share of the insurance and the assets. David Nelson's priority was the 4 children. He ensured that the estate was structured to provide for Tracy, Gunnar, Matthew, and Sam. For Kristin herself, the judge who heard her petition for a share of the estate rejected it. There was nothing for her from Ricky's estate beyond what had already been settled in the divorce. The funeral itself was a scene of visible conflict. An argument erupted between Kristin and her daughter Tracy that became physical. Accounts describe Kristin throwing Tracy to the ground and using her purse as a weapon. It was the kind of scene that should have remained private, but became part of the documented record of this family's collapse. a scene of grief and rage, and old wounds erupting at the worst possible moment. The 4 children inherited what remained of their father's estate. Kristin inherited nothing from the man she had spent half of her life with. Chapter 6. After the crash, addiction, rehab, and the battle for Sam. If Ricky's death in December 1985 was the event that ended whatever anchor remained in Kristin's life, the 2 years that followed were the period in which the full cost of everything became visible. By 1987, 2 years after Ricky's death, Kristin Nelson was in drug rehabilitation. The addiction that had been developing throughout the marriage, and that had worsened during the divorce, had reached the point where professional intervention was required. She was 42 years old. She was the mother of 4 children, 3 of whom were effectively adults or near adults, and she was in a rehabilitation facility, working to address a substance dependency that had been building for more than a decade. It was at this point that her brother Mark Harmon and his wife Pam Dauber made a decision that would fracture the family in a way that outlasted the immediate crisis. Mark Harmon and Pam Dauber petitioned a California court for custody of Sam Nelson, Kristin's youngest child, who was 13 years old in 1987. The grounds for the petition were that Kristin was incapable of providing adequate parenting as a result of her addiction and the instability of her life. The evidence presented in support of the petition was specific and, in parts, devastating. Sam's own psychiatrist testified on the boy's behalf. The psychiatrist described Sam as depicting his mother as a dragon, not in the sense of strength, but in the sense of danger and unpredictability. The 13-year-old boy described his mother's mood swings as frightening and complained that she prevented him from spending time with his siblings. This was testimony from Sam's own psychiatrist based on conversations with Sam himself. It was the kind of testimony that doesn't arrive from nowhere. Sam's history during the divorce years was already a record of instability. He had lived with his Aunt Kelly during the divorce proceedings. He had spent 18 months with his grandparents. He had gone to live with Mark Harmon and Pam Dauber. He had been passed between the available adults in his family while his parents' marriage collapsed around him. By the time he was 13, he had lived in multiple different households, managed by multiple different adults, with varying degrees of stability. Kristin's response to the custody petition was complicated. She later acknowledged that Mark had been instrumental in getting her into rehabilitation, that his intervention, however it had manifested, had pushed her toward getting the help she needed. She credited him with saving her life. At the same time, she was fighting the custody petition with everything available to her, and she used what she had. She alleged that Pam Dauber used cocaine. She alleged this publicly as a counter to the custody petition, in the specific calculated way of someone who understands that the best defense is an attack on the other party's credibility. The allegation was significant enough that Mark Harmon dropped the custody petition, rather than allow it to proceed further. The court's outcome left Kristin with custody of Sam. Mark Harmon was granted visitation rights. Kristin, Mark, and Sam agreed to enter family therapy together as a condition of the resolution. Kristin was also ordered to stay 200 yards from Mark and Pam's home and from Pam's workplace. The family had survived the custody battle, but survival and recovery are different things. Chapter 7. The Second Marriage, the Move, and the Final Years. In 1988, 1 year after the custody battle over Sam was resolved, Kristin Nelson married for the second time. Her new husband was Mark Tinker, a television producer and director who worked primarily in dramatic series and had credits across multiple successful productions. He was a serious professional figure in the television industry, not simply a celebrity by association, and the marriage represented, at least on paper, a kind of grounding. a connection to someone with a stable professional identity who operated outside the particular fishbowl of old Hollywood. The marriage lasted 12 years. They divorced in 2000. By 2000, Kristin was 55 years old. She had been married twice and divorced twice. She had fought a custody battle with her own brother. She had watched her ex-husband die in a plane crash. She had been through rehabilitation. She had raised, with varying degrees of success, 4 children who were now adults building their own careers, and she was divorced again. After the divorce from Mark Tinker, Kristin moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The move was significant. Santa Fe is not Los Angeles. It is not the entertainment industry, not the world of celebrity adjacency that Kristin had inhabited since she was 12 years old. It is a city with a strong arts community, a serious visual arts scene, and a climate and landscape that is as far from the coastal California aesthetic as you can get while remaining in the American Southwest. This is where Kristin went. And it is where, in the final chapter of her life, she found the thing that had perhaps been there all along, but had been consistently buried under the weight of everything else: her painting. Kristin Nelson had been a painter since the age of 17. She had her first one-woman art show in 1967, in the middle of her marriage to Ricky, before the worst of the addiction years, before the divorce and the custody battles and the plane crash. The painting had continued quietly and persistently throughout everything. In Santa Fe, it became the center of her life in a way it had never been able to be when she was defined primarily by her relationships and her family. Her paintings were shown in galleries. They were collected. One of them, a painting called "When the Kennedys Were in the White House," was purchased by Jacqueline Kennedy. That is not a minor detail. That is a painting sold to one of the most famous women in the world, a genuine transaction in the art market on the basis of the work's quality rather than the artist's family connections. Kristin Nelson was a serious painter, recognized as such by serious collectors. She also wrote. She published a book. She built in Santa Fe in her 60s, a life that was quieter and more genuinely her own than the life she had lived in Los Angeles from 17 to her mid-50s. The addiction, which she had fought and, by the accounts available, largely continued to manage through the decades after rehabilitation, was not absent from this chapter of her life, but it was also not the defining feature of it in the way it had been. She was not reconciled with everyone from her past. The relationship with her brother Mark Harmon remained complicated by the 1987 custody battle, an episode that neither party had publicly addressed in any detail in the decades since. The relationship with Tracy, her eldest, had survived the conflicts of the divorce and post-divorce years. Sam had pursued his own music career, following his father's and brother's paths with varying degrees of public attention. In the final years of her life in Santa Fe, Kristin Nelson was a woman who had traveled an extraordinary distance from where she had started, from the Marymount High School girl who had sat next to Mia Farrow, from the 17-year-old bride walking down the aisle at St. Martin of Tours, from the woman who had been photographed at Ricky Nelson's side while the television cameras created the illusion of the perfect American family. She had not arrived at peace, exactly, but she had arrived at something that looked, from the outside, like a version of herself that was more genuinely her own than any previous version had been. Chapter 8, April 27th, 2018, the end. On April 27th, 2018, Kristin Nelson died at her home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She was 72 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. It was sudden. It was unexpected, or at least that was the word her daughter Tracy used when she announced it on Facebook on May 1st, 2018, 4 days after it happened. Sudden, unexpected. 2 words that carry, in their simplicity, the weight of a loss that had not been prepared for. Tracy Nelson confirmed her mother's death to the world through social media. Not through a press release, not through a publicist, not through the machinery of celebrity announcements, through Facebook. Because Kristin Nelson had not, by the end of her life, been the kind of person around whom that machinery still operated. She had moved to New Mexico. She had made her paintings. She had gotten on with her life. And when she died, it was her daughter who told the world, in the most direct and personal medium available. The response was muted compared to what it might have been for someone more immediately prominent. Kristin Nelson had been, in the 1960s, part of one of the most famous families in American entertainment. By 2018, she was primarily remembered as Ricky Nelson's ex-wife, as the woman who had been married to the teen idol, who had been part of the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, who had appeared in Adam 12 and a handful of other productions. Her own artistic work, the decades of painting, the gallery shows, the Jacqueline Kennedy acquisition, was largely unknown to the general public. She had no Wikipedia page that did justice to the complexity of what she had lived through. She had no biography that adequately captured the distance between the girl she had been at 17 and the woman she was at 72. She had 4 children scattered across their own careers and their own lives, who had each absorbed in their own ways what it had meant to grow up in the household she and Ricky Nelson had created. Chapter 9. The 4 Children, What They Built from What They Were Given. The 4 children of Kristin and Ricky Nelson are, in a way, the most accurate measure of everything their parents' marriage produced. Not the television shows, not the record sales, not the estate on Mulholland Drive, the people who came out of it. Tracy Nelson was born in 1963 and inherited something from both parents, her father's charisma and her mother's resilience, combined with a talent for performance that she developed entirely on her own terms. She became a professional actress and dancer, appearing in numerous film and television productions across a career that she has sustained on the basis of genuine professional skill. She appeared in Down and Out in Beverly Hills in 1986 and had a recurring role on the television series Father Dowling Mysteries from 1989 to 1991. She has continued to work consistently in the decades since, in precisely the way that people who build real careers rather than fame-adjacent notoriety tend to do. It was Tracy who announced her mother's death on Facebook in May 2018. It was Tracy who had the argument with her mother at Ricky's funeral in 1985. The relationship between them, complex, sometimes explosive, enduring, is the relationship of 2 women who were too much alike to be comfortable with each other and too connected to separate. Gunnar and Matthew Nelson, the twins, born September 20th, 1967, moved in with their father approximately 3 months before his death in 1985, when they turned 18. Whatever the complications of Ricky's personal life, the twins were devoted to him as a father and as a musician. They formed the band Nelson shortly after his death, a conscious decision to carry his musical legacy forward through their own work. Their 1990 debut album, After the Rain, was certified platinum. The single, Can't Live Without Your Love and Affection, reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making them the first act in history to have a #1 hit when their parent had also had a #1 hit. Their father had reached #1 with Poor Little Fool in 1958. The Nelson twins reached #1 32 years later. It is an extraordinary father-son musical lineage, and the twins have spent their adult careers honoring it, continuing to perform, to record, and to keep their father's music alive in the culture. They also had to navigate the specific complication of being raised in a household of considerable dysfunction while also being asked by the culture to represent their father's legacy. The cognitive dissonance of that, being the sons of a man who was publicly perfect and privately complicated, being the children of a woman who was fighting addiction while they were teenagers, is something that neither twin has fully addressed in public, but it is present in the story. Sam Nelson was born in 1974 and had the most turbulent childhood of the four. He was the youngest, the most removed from the years when the marriage had at least the appearance of stability, the most directly in the path of the custody disputes that followed the divorce. He spent time with his Aunt Kelly, with his grandparents, with his Uncle Mark Harmon, before returning to live with his mother. He was the child who, at 13, was described by his own psychiatrist as depicting his mother as a dragon. He was the child around whom the most overt family conflict circulated in 1987. Sam followed his siblings into music, becoming a singer and songwriter who has continued to work in the entertainment industry. He has spoken rarely about his childhood in any extended public forum, which is itself telling. The things that happened to him between 1974 and 1988 were not the kinds of things that most people choose to discuss publicly when they've built lives that are distinct from those events. All four children followed their parents into the entertainment and music industry. All four built careers that were their own, not simply extensions of the Nelson family brand. All four survived what their parents' marriage had produced: the instability, the addiction, the public conflict, the loss of their father at the worst possible time. They survived it in different ways and with different degrees of visible difficulty, and some of those ways of surviving remain private. What they were given was not a stable foundation. What they were given was talent, visible and documented, and the specific toughness that comes from growing up inside a family that required its children to absorb a great deal. They absorbed it. They kept going. They made things. That is not nothing. Closing. What Kristin Nelson's life actually was. Kristin Nelson said it herself near the end. She had spent her whole life fighting the fairy tale, first trying to be it, then trying to tell the truth. The fairy tale was specific and visible and had a specific address. It was the address of a television show that ran 14 seasons on ABC. It was the address of the Mulholland Drive estate that had once belonged to Errol Flynn and that a broken marriage had forced them to list. It was the address of a Catholic church in Los Angeles where a 17-year-old girl married a 22-year-old rock star on April 20th, 1963, with a baby already on the way, and the eyes of the American public on everything they did. The truth was the addiction, the divorce, the custody battles, the funeral where she fought with her daughter while the cameras circled, the judge who rejected her claim on the estate, the years in rehabilitation that her brother's intervention made possible, and that cost her the child she fought him to keep, the silence of Sons of Sana, where she went finally to paint and to finally, partially, live as herself rather than as a function of someone else's fame. She was not a villain in the story. She was not a victim in the passive sense, not someone to whom things simply happened. She was a person who entered an extraordinarily pressurized life at 17 years old, before she had the emotional equipment or the lived experience to navigate it, and who was shaped by that pressure in ways that were sometimes destructive and sometimes genuinely creative. She painted. She wrote. She built a body of artwork that was recognized by serious collectors, including one of the most famous women in the world, who bought one of her paintings and hung it. She raised 4 children who grew up to make things of their own, a career actress, twin musicians who reached #1 on the Billboard chart, a singer-songwriter who followed his family's musical tradition. She survived rehabilitation, survived the custody battle, survived the death of the man she had spent her adult life entangled with. She moved to New Mexico and made a life there that was quieter and more genuinely hers than anything she had built in Los Angeles. The devastation in her story is real and should be named clearly. 4 children who grew up inside the turbulence of her addiction, her grief, and her family's collapse did not come through it unscathed. Sam Nelson, passed between relatives as a young child, described by his own psychiatrist at 13 as depicting his mother as a dragon, was not given the childhood he deserved. Tracy, whose relationship with her mother was close enough to be explosive and complicated enough to erupt at her own father's funeral, carried something from those years that is not simple to carry. The twins who moved in with their father 3 months before he died and then had to build their lives in the immediate aftermath of losing him, they too absorbed what the marriage and its collapse had produced. But the devastation is not the whole story. It is the part that gets attention, the addiction, the plane crash, the funeral fight, the custody battle. The part that doesn't get the attention is the Santa Fe chapter, the painter, the Jacqueline Kennedy acquisition. The woman who is, at the end of her life, making something entirely her own. Kristin Nelson died on April 27, 2018. She was 72 years old. Her daughter told the world 4 days later on Facebook. Sudden, unexpected. She had been fighting the fairy tale since she was 17 years old. She never completely won, but she never stopped fighting. And at the end, she was doing it on her own terms, in her own house, making work that was entirely hers. That is not nothing. For someone who spent the first half of her life defined by other people's stories, her father's athletic legacy, her brother's television career, her husband's rock and roll fame, her ex-husband's devastating death, the last chapter in Santa Fe, painting pictures that sold to collectors, was the chapter that was finally, fully, unambiguously hers. She deserved more of it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.